July 7th, 1937. A small contingent of Japanese soldiers engaged in military maneuvers near the historic Marco Polo Bridge on the outskirts of Beijing, known as Peiping at the time, approached the fortified town of Wangping with a pressing request. They demanded permission to enter the walled enclave to search for one of their missing soldiers. However, the Chinese garrison station in Wangping sternly denied their request, maintaining a tense standoff. Suddenly, the crack of a gunshot pierced the air, shattering the uneasy silence and igniting fierce exchanges of gunfire between the two forces. The situation rapidly escalated, plunging both sides into a chaotic conflict. The Marco Polo Bridge incident marked the beginning of World War II in Asia. As a brief background, the origin of the Second Sino-Japanese War, or the Anti-Japanese War in China, or the Great East Asia War in Japan, can be traced back to the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 95. The Japanese victory in that war led to expansion in Taiwan and Korea. The collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911 led to increased Japanese influence to the point that the new Chinese Republic had no choice but to accept the humiliating 21 demands in 1915. In 1931, the Japanese took over Manchuria and later created a puppet government under the ineffectual head of the last Qing Emperor, Huai. By the time of the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the nationalists and the communists were barely 7 months into an alliance, dubbed the Second United Front. The Japanese launched an all-out offensive in late July 1937, swiftly and alarmingly occupying the Chinese cities of Peiping and Tientsin. In November, they swooped down and captured the significant commercial hub and port of Shanghai, despite heavy Chinese resistance. By mid-December, the nationalist capital of Nanking, or Nanjing, capitulated after the liquidation of almost all official Chinese soldiers from the city defended by untrained auxiliary troops. What followed was one of the most brutal atrocities of all time: the rape of Nanking. Chinese soldiers were hunted down and killed by the thousands and buried in mass graves. Many Japanese troops who were keen on vengeance for their fallen comrades massacred entire families, including the elderly and infants. Tens of thousands of women were raped and later mutilated and murdered. Corpses littered the streets for many months after, and at least a third of Nanjing's buildings were looted and burned to the ground. Over 6 weeks, between 20,000 and 80,000 women were raped, and between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians were murdered. Shocked by the atrocity, Chinese troops were determined to avenge their fallen comrades and families, but were forced to retreat further west and south, with the capital moved to Hankow. By 1938, a Chinese defeat seemed inevitable due to having no allies, no aid, and a vast retreat to the country's interior. But in June 1938, the Chinese blew up the dikes of the Yellow River to delay the advance of the Japanese invaders. While successful, it came at a cost. 500,000 to 1 million Chinese civilians perished, millions were homeless, and millions of acres of farmland were ruined. In October 1938, the Japanese took the capital city of Hankow, captured Canton or Guangzhou, and advanced northward and westward from Peiping. With total dominance of both sea and air, the Japanese showed no mercy in bombing Chinese cities. Yet, Chinese resistance persisted. Chiang Kai-shek moved the capital to Chongqing, with many of China's leaders migrating to the far west in Sichuan and Yunnan. Japan's control over occupied China was only refined to the cities and railway lines, with unsuccessful attempts to induce many Chinese to take office in the recent puppet government in Nanking. In the countryside, Japan's authority was challenged by nationalists and communist guerrillas who resisted Japan for the duration of the war. In 1939, the war reached a stalemate, with Japanese forces making little progress beyond the port cities and the urban areas south of Peiping. This is widely attributed to stiff Chinese resistance, China's vast geographical size, and a lack of infrastructure. China's persistent defense was not in vain, as foreign aid began to seep through and Japan stalled its advance. The Burma Road proved to be one of the most vital supply lines of the war. Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, even though he ideologically despised the Chinese nationalists, supplied them with arms because he perceived a victorious Japan as a threat to the USSR. In 1940 and 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States extended credits to China to purchase military arms and included them in the Lend-Lease program. On August 1, 1941, the United States imposed an oil embargo on Japan, halting 80% of its supplies and intended to bring its territorial expansionism to a halt. Due to severe shortages due to the embargo, lack of retreat, and the belief that the US was unwilling to negotiate, the Japanese concluded that they needed to act swiftly in a high-risk plan. The US, despite its pro-Chinese sentiments, was willing to negotiate with Japan, but that evaporated when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack on December 7, 1941. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan and soon allied with China. Japan quickly captured Hong Kong after the Pearl Harbor attack and Burma in 1942, which blocked off the crucial Burma Road. China now had only two routes left between its allies: poorly constructed roads across Xinjiang or Jiangxiang, and air passage from Assam and the British Raj over the Himalayas. However, Japan remained bogged down in China with between 500,000 and 600,000 troops, and 38 of its 51 divisions were stationed there. In February 1942, Chiang Kai-shek visited India to meet with Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, leaders of the Indian independence movement, to persuade them to encourage their followers into the war. As a result, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was enraged and gave a speech demanding India's independence. While primarily ineffective, the Doolittle Raid, the first attack on Japan from the United States on April 18, 1942, proved to be a morale boost and relied on China to land most of its aircraft. From the Battle of Midway on June 4th to 7th, 1942, the Japanese defeat turned the tide of the war in the Pacific and Asia, as Japan was now on the defensive rather than the offensive. In November of 1943, Chiang Kai-shek was invited to Cairo, Egypt, with Roosevelt and Churchill as sovereign equals and China as one of the four policemen: the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain. However, relations between the Chinese and the US weren't as peachy, with General Joseph Stilwell of Chiang's American Chief of Staff regarding Chiang as corrupt and incompetent. Chiang viewed Stilwell as insubordinate and lacking empathy for the immense burdens China had to shoulder before America entered the war after Pearl Harbor. Japan launched the Ichigo Offensive in 1944, capturing air bases and gaining more territory around Henan and Jiangxia. China repelled two additional Japanese advances in the summer of 1945 and resumed its advance in Burma and counterattacked in Guangxi. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August and invaded Manchuria. The Japanese surrendered on September 2, 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing World War II and the Second Sino-Japanese War to an end. A sixth of the Chinese, 100 million, became refugees in their own country. Estimates between 12, 14, or even up to 20 million Chinese died during the war, both military and civilian. The Japanese surrender briefly ended the war in an exhausted China, but later reignited the Chinese Civil War in 1946. As China and the United States transitioned from allies to adversaries during the Cold War, public memory of China's role as part of the Allies diminished on both sides of the Pacific. Due to the circumstances of the Cold War, both the West and Communist China were highly motivated to avoid revisiting their alliance during World War II or the Second Sino-Japanese War. As a result, this aspect of history remained in the shadows of historiography for at least a quarter of a century. However, the Chinese assistance to the Allied war effort cannot be understated. Historian Raina Mitter, the author of Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, 1937 to 1945, quipped, "The escalation that Japan had to go through in the following years because of Chinese resistance would never have happened. That means no Pearl Harbor, because without the escalation of Japanese attacks on China, you don't get the desperate hunger for resources that leads ultimately to the oil embargo and President Roosevelt's decisions in 1940 and 1941. And if you don't have Pearl Harbor, you don't have an Asian war that can then be joined with the European War." Documenting done.
Chinese troops battle their way into Changte, gateway to the rich rice lands in western Hunan province. 6 weeks before, 8 Japanese divisions had taken the city. 4 times in 40 days, Changte changed hands. Now crack, well-armed Chinese forces sweep back. This time the enemy is in retreat.